It was an unremarkable Wednesday morning in a quiet Kansas town, the kind of day where time felt sluggish, stretching endlessly between slow-moving hours. The local hardware store, Green's Supplies, sat at the corner of Main Street, its wooden sign weathered by years of sun and storm. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, illuminating shelves stacked with tools, paint cans, and forgotten inventory gathering dust in the corners. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Keanu Reeves stepped inside, the chime of the doorbell barely registering as he took in the space. Dressed in a faded hoodie and well-worn jeans, he looked like any other passerby, just another stranger killing time in a small-town store. His hands trailed idly over the rows of brushes and varnish, his gaze settling on a display of wood finishes. A couple stood nearby, discussing their home project, debating between oak and walnut stains. Keanu, always the conversationalist when it came to craftsmanship, offered a quiet suggestion, his tone warm and unassuming. From behind the counter, Tom Green scowled. At 52, Tom was a man worn down by the weight of too many burdens. His mother's battle with Alzheimer's had consumed what little peace he had left. His daughter, Lisa, was struggling to afford her college tuition, and business at the store was sluggish at best, leaving him to wonder how much longer he could keep the doors open. Every day felt like a fight against time, against circumstance, against the relentless pull of disappointment. So when he noticed the unkempt man lingering near the counter, chatting easily with customers, but making no move to purchase anything, his patience snapped. With an irritated sigh, he grabbed a wrench from the nearby toolbox and pointed it at the stranger. His voice, rough from years of stress, carried across the quiet store. "Hey, buddy, this ain't a museum. If you're not buying anything, I've got a business to run." Keanu paused mid-reach for a paintbrush, turning slowly toward the source of the outburst. His hands lifted slightly in a silent gesture of surrender, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes, beneath the quiet composure, there was something else, an understanding, a sadness so subtle it was almost imperceptible. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice steady but sincere. "I didn't mean to be in the way." Without another word, he picked up a small can of varnish and a brush, walking toward the counter with the same unhurried grace that had made him a legend on and off the screen. He pulled a few crumpled bills from his pocket, set them down, and waited while Tom rang him up with stiff, mechanical movements. The transaction was over in seconds, but something about it lingered. Keanu gave a small nod, as if in farewell, then turned and strode toward the exit. The glass door swung shut behind him with a soft chime, and moments later, the unmistakable rumble of a motorcycle filled the air before fading into the distance. Tom exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Another drifter, another waste of time. He turned back to his work, muttering under his breath as he rearranged a few tools on the counter. He had barely placed the wrench back in its tray when Lisa, his 23-year-old daughter, came rushing up to him, her face pale with shock. "Dad," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have any idea who that was?" Tom, still irritated, barely glanced up. "No, and I don't care. Just some guy wasting my time." Lisa's hands curled into fists at her sides, her frustration momentarily overtaking her shock. She turned to the window, her eyes locking onto the disappearing silhouette of the motorcycle. That was Keanu Reeves. For a moment, Tom's hands stilled. He looked up, his brows furrowed in confusion. "The Matrix guy?" Lisa nodded, her voice hushed but firm. "Yeah, and you just yelled at him." The color drained from Tom's face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The weight of what had just happened crashed over him all at once, settling in his chest like a lead weight. Outside, the small town remained unchanged, cars rolling past, the sun warm against the pavement, a few birds flitting across the sky. But inside Green's Supplies, something had shifted, and Tom, for the first time in a long time, felt the unmistakable sting of regret. The sun had barely risen over the quiet Kansas town when Tom Green unlocked the door to his small hardware store, ready for another slow, uneventful day. He had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying yesterday's events in his head. The realization that he had snapped at Keanu Reeves, had settled in his gut like a lead weight. But as he stepped outside to adjust the sign by the entrance, he was met with a sight that sent a jolt through his system. A convoy of sleek black SUVs was parked along the curb, their tinted windows gleaming in the early morning light. Beside them, the unmistakable silhouette of a motorcycle stood, its polished chrome reflecting the first golden rays of the sun. And leaning casually against it, arms crossed over his chest, was Keanu Reeves. Only this time, he didn't look like the unassuming drifter from yesterday. Gone were the faded hoodie and worn-out jeans. Instead, he was dressed in a crisp black blazer over a dark gray shirt, paired with fitted jeans and boots polished just enough to show effort without vanity. He looked like a man who belonged in boardrooms just as easily as he did on the open road. A man whose presence could command a room without a single word. Tom swallowed hard, instinctively wiping his hands on the front of his apron. This wasn't just a friendly return visit. Lisa, who had been stocking shelves inside, peeked through the window, her eyes growing impossibly wide. "Dad," she whispered urgently, hurrying to his side. "What is happening right now?" Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry. Keanu pushed off his motorcycle with effortless grace, his movements fluid and relaxed. Like a man who had nothing to prove, he stepped toward them with an easy smile. But there was something beneath it, something unreadable yet undeniably purposeful. "You're back," Tom managed, his voice rougher than he intended. Keanu nodded, his expression warm but steady. "Yeah, I am." His voice carried the same quiet sincerity that had made him one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. "I wanted to talk to you about this place." Tom frowned, his confusion mounting. "What about it?" Keanu's gaze flickered over the store, taking in the well-worn shelves, the handwritten price tags, the faded photos pinned to the bulletin board near the counter, snapshots of a past filled with hard work, laughter, and memories. There was a wistfulness in his expression, a quiet respect. "This place reminds me of the hardware store my dad used to take me to when I was a kid," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "It's rare to find places like this anymore." For a moment, Tom didn't know how to respond. His store? A place Keanu Reeves, a man who had seen the world, who had walked red carpets and lived among the elite, found special. Lisa, sensing the significance of the moment, stepped closer, her breath hitching slightly. "It does?" Keanu nodded, his fingers brushing lightly against the countertop as if reconnecting with an old memory. "Yeah," he said simply, "it does." Tom's brow furrowed, uncertainty settling deep in his chest. "That's kind of you to say," he muttered, still unsure where this was going. And then Keanu reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a neatly folded set of documents. He handed them over with a measured deliberation, his eyes steady as he watched Tom's reaction. Tom hesitated before unfolding the papers. His hands, usually steady from years of manual labor, trembled slightly as he skimmed the words. And then he froze. His stomach dropped. Lisa let out a small, startled gasp. "Wait, you?" Tom's voice trailed off as he tried to process what he was seeing. He looked up, his eyes searching for Keanu's for some kind of confirmation. Keanu offered a small nod. "I bought this chain a few years ago." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I like to keep it quiet," Keanu continued, his voice even, unassuming. "But I visit different locations whenever I can. Yours caught my eye." Tom staggered back a step, gripping the counter for support. He felt like the ground had just shifted beneath him, like someone had taken the entire foundation of his reality and given it a firm shake. Lisa's hands flew to her mouth. "You own this place," she whispered in disbelief. Keanu's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I do." Tom opened his mouth, then closed it, his mind scrambling for words. "But yesterday, why didn't you say anything?" Keanu's expression softened, his voice gentler now. Because I wasn't here to pull rank, he said simply. I was here to see the place, to talk to the people. He glanced at Tom meaningfully. I know what it's like to have a bad day. Tom swallowed hard. Guilt crept up his spine, curling around his ribs. He had dismissed Keanu, snapped at him like he was nothing. And yet, here he was, still standing there, still offering something more than just words. Keanu sighed lightly, his gaze distant for a moment before locking back onto Tom's. But kindness? He let the word linger, allowing its weight to settle before finishing. Kindness doesn't cost anything. Tom's breath caught. The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than any grand gesture ever could. Silence stretched between them, thick with understanding, regret, and something else, something unspoken, yet profoundly felt. Lisa was the first to recover. She stepped forward, her voice unsteady but filled with admiration. You didn't have to come back, she murmured. Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. Maybe not, he said, but I wanted to. Tom rubbed a hand down his face, letting out a long, shaky breath. He looked back at the papers in his hands, at the truth laid out in black and white. And for the first time in a very long time, something inside him shifted. Not fear, not frustration, hope. He met Keanu's gaze, this time without skepticism, without the armor of a man beaten down by life. And finally, he asked, "What happens next?" Keanu's smile widened, just slightly, but enough to lighten the air between them. "Well," he said, his voice warm with promise, "let's talk about that." The weight of Keanu's words settled over Tom like a heavy fog, thick with meaning and impossible to ignore. Shame twisted in his gut, curling around his ribs with an unforgiving grip. Yesterday, he had dismissed this man, brushed him off like just another drifter wasting time. And yet, here Keanu stood, not with anger, not with condescension, but with something far more powerful: understanding, compassion, a willingness to help. Tom's throat felt tight. He wanted to speak, to find some way to bridge the gap between regret and gratitude. But before he could, Keanu took a step closer, his posture open, his presence steady. "I'm not here to make life harder for you, Tom," he said, his voice measured, yet filled with quiet conviction. "In fact, I want to help." Tom hesitated. His whole life, he had prided himself on being self-sufficient. He had built this store from the ground up, weathered recessions, fought through slow seasons, kept the doors open even when it felt impossible. Accepting help wasn't in his nature, not because of pride, but because he had never believed it was an option. People didn't just offer lifelines, especially not in small-town America. But Keanu Reeves, the Keanu Reeves, was standing in front of him, doing just that. Tom swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of help?" Keanu's smile returned, soft but resolute, carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made it impossible to doubt him. "Let's talk," he said, gesturing toward the back of the store. The break room was nothing special, a simple, utilitarian space, dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light. A scuffed wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs that had seen better days. Against one wall, a faded vending machine hummed faintly, stocked with snacks that had likely expired months ago. The air smelled of old coffee and sawdust, the scent of years spent working long hours in a place that had become more than just a business. It was home. Tom shuffled in first, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck, feeling suddenly self-conscious. It wasn't much. This room. It wasn't the polished, glamorous spaces Keanu was probably used to, but it was his. Keanu followed, taking everything in with a quiet appreciation. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep understanding. He moved toward the chair across from Tom, but before sitting, he ran his hand across the wooden tabletop. "This table's been here a long time, hasn't it?" Keanu asked, his voice thoughtful. Tom gave a small, stiff nod. "Since my dad ran the store. He used to sit right there," he said, gesturing to the seat Keanu was about to take. "Had his coffee here every morning." Keanu smiled, something flickering behind his eyes. "It reminds me of the places my dad used to take me," he said, Shops like this, where owners knew their customers by name. The words landed heavier than Tom expected. For a moment, the two men just sat there, the air between them shifting from unfamiliarity to something else, something anchored in shared experience. Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice quieter now, almost like a confession. "I've seen places like this disappear," he admitted. "Every time I visit a new town, I find another boarded-up storefront, another family business struggling to hold on. It's heartbreaking." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't need to hear more. He had lived it. "When I lost my dad," Keanu continued, his voice carrying the weight of something deeper, "places like this became my anchor. They reminded me of home, of the little moments that meant everything." He took a breath, his fingers tapping absently against the edge of the table. "But every year, they disappear." Tom exhaled, staring down at his calloused hands. He knew that fear. Every time he locked up at night, he wondered how much longer he could keep doing this. He had poured everything into this store, his sweat, his heart, his life. But was it enough? Finally, he cleared his throat. "So what are you saying?" Keanu leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "I want to invest in this store," he said simply. "Update what needs updating, but keep what makes it special. And I want to build a foundation to help other small businesses like yours thrive." Tom blinked, his breath hitched. Investment, foundation, survival. He had spent so long trying to figure out how to stay afloat that the idea of thriving had never even crossed his mind. His voice came out rough. "Why?" Keanu's expression softened, as if he had been expecting the question. "Because places like this matter, Tom." His words were firm but gentle, filled with quiet certainty. Tom ran a hand through his thinning hair, trying to process what was happening. It felt unreal. Lisa had been standing in the doorway, silent up until now, but something about the moment stirred her, and she finally spoke. "You don't even know us," she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Keanu turned toward her, his eyes warm. "Because I've been where you are." Tom frowned, confused, but Keanu didn't elaborate. Instead, he looked around the room, at the framed pictures on the wall, at the half-empty coffee pot sitting in the corner. "This isn't just a store. It's part of your family, part of your story, and that's worth saving." Tom swallowed past the tightness in his throat. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was fighting this battle alone. Keanu reached into his blazer pocket, pulling out a small, weathered photograph. He placed it gently on the table and slid it toward Tom. Tom picked it up, his brows furrowing as he studied the image. A young boy, maybe 6 or 7, perched on his father's shoulders, smiling in front of an old hardware store that looked strikingly familiar. Tom looked up, his chest tightening. "This is you?" Keanu nodded. "That's me, and that's my dad." A long silence stretched between them, and in that silence, Tom finally understood. This wasn't just business. This was personal. Keanu wasn't just offering an investment. He was offering something far greater. A chance to hold on. A chance to rebuild. A chance to keep something meaningful alive. Tom set the photo down carefully, looking across the table at the man sitting before him. For the first time since they met, Tom wasn't skeptical. He wasn't uncertain. He was just grateful. He took a slow, measured breath, then finally spoke. "Okay, Keanu." A pause. "Let's talk." And just like that, everything changed. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Lisa, who had been standing quietly, trying to process everything, finally found her voice. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a question that had been forming in her mind since the moment Keanu walked back into their store. "Why?" she asked, her gaze locking onto his. "Why would you care so much?" Keanu turned toward her, and for the first time, Lisa saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, a depth of emotion so raw, so unguarded, that it sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just here out of generosity. He wasn't here because of duty or publicity. He was here because this place meant something to him in a way that went beyond words. His Adam's apple bobbed slightly as he swallowed, his voice measured but carrying a quiet tremor beneath it. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said. Lisa barely breathed. Keanu's eyes drifted, unfocused for a moment, as if looking back through time, sifting through memories he rarely allowed himself to visit. "I lost my best friend before he turned 30, he continued, his voice tinged with an ache that had never fully faded. "We had dreams of making it together, growing old, laughing about the past, but life had other plans." Tom, who had been listening with wary curiosity up until now, felt something shift inside him. He had lost people, too. He knew that kind of grief, the kind that lingers in the quiet moments, that turns birthdays and anniversaries into reminders of absence. Keanu took a steadying breath. "I lost my sister to leukemia." Lisa's throat tightened. She was the strongest person I knew. His lips pressed together for a moment, as if he were trying to keep emotions at bay. "She fought for years, and I fought with her. But some fights, no matter how much you give, you don't win." The room felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of his words had drawn them all closer together. Tom exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table as he stared down at his calloused hands. He had spent years thinking his burdens were his alone to bear. But here was Keanu Reeves, one of the most recognizable men on the planet, carrying grief just as heavy, just as relentless. Keanu's voice grew quieter, but somehow, it only made his words more powerful. "And I lost the woman I loved." Lisa blinked back tears. Tom closed his eyes for a second. Inhaling sharply, Keanu looked down at his hands, as if turning over pieces of a past that had long since settled into scars. "We were going to have a life together, a family, and then she was gone." He let out a slow, uneven breath. Just like that, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Keanu lifted his head and looked around the store, the old wooden shelves, the walls lined with faded photographs, the handwritten price tags that hadn't changed in decades. There was something almost reverent in the way he took it all in. "But what kept me going," he said softly, "were places like this." Tom's brows furrowed slightly. "Places that reminded me of love, of connection, of humanity." Keanu's voice was steady now, filled with certainty. "Places that felt like home, even when I didn't have one." Lisa wiped at her cheek, her fingers trembling slightly. Tom let out a slow breath, then looked at his daughter. He had spent so long believing that carrying his burdens alone made him strong. But now, standing in front of him, was a man who had every reason to give up on the world, yet chose, instead, to give back to it. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on the worn table between them. His presence wasn't overwhelming, but it was undeniable. "I know what it feels like to think the world is moving on without you." His voice was calm, but it carried the quiet weight of someone who had lived through the kind of loss that never truly fades. Tom swallowed hard, his gaze falling to the photograph Keanu had placed on the table earlier, the one of a young boy sitting on his father's shoulders outside a hardware store that looked just like this one. Lisa's voice broke the silence. "You don't just want to save this store, do you?" Keanu offered her a small, knowing smile. "No," he admitted. "I want to save what it stands for." Tom exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something more. The grand reopening of the store felt like a new beginning. The once faded walls had been refreshed with a new coat of paint, and the shelves, once sparse and disorganized, now stood proudly stocked with supplies that the community actually needed. Customers returned, not just to shop but to reconnect, their faces filled with warmth and familiarity. Laughter echoed through the aisles. Conversations stretched longer than usual, and for the first time in years, Tom could see the future of his store, not as a burden, but as a place of belonging. At the heart of it all was Keanu. He wasn't just an investor, he had become part of their lives. Most days, he could be found stacking boxes in the storage room or rearranging tools with an effortless ease, as if he had worked there all his life. He chatted with customers, listening intently to their stories as if each one mattered. When Lisa struggled with her studies, Keanu would pull up a chair, helping her with math problems in between restocking the shelves. Even Tom, who had once been skeptical of his presence, found himself enjoying their late-night talks about life, loss, and the things that truly mattered. It didn't take long for the town to notice. The Hollywood star who had once seemed untouchable had woven himself into their world with quiet humility. He never carried himself like a celebrity. He was just Keanu, the man who rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside them, the man who showed up early and stayed late, the man who somehow made everyone feel like they belonged. But Tom knew, deep down, that it couldn't last forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple, Tom stepped outside to find Keanu sitting on the wooden bench just outside the store. His gaze was fixed on the distance, the soft glow of the street lights reflecting off his dark eyes. There was a stillness to him, a quiet farewell in the way he sat. Tom took a slow breath before stepping forward. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Keanu didn't turn right away. He let the words settle, as if giving them the space they deserved. Finally, he nodded, a small but certain motion. "Yeah," he murmured. "It's time." Tom swallowed hard, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them from fidgeting. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it, and yet, it still felt like something was slipping through his fingers. He let out a slow breath. "We'll never forget what you've done for us." Keanu turned then, a gentle smile playing at the corner of his lips. "That's not why I did it," he said, his voice warm but firm. Tom gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I know. That's what makes it even harder to say goodbye." Keanu stood, stretching slightly before placing a firm hand on Tom's shoulder. His grip was steady, reassuring. "Just promise me something," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Tom felt the lump in his throat grow. "Anything?" Keanu's eyes held his, filled with something deeper than words could express. "Take care of each other," he said simply, "and when you're back on your feet, help someone else." Tom nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He understood. He truly did. Keanu gave his shoulder one last squeeze before stepping away. He moved toward his motorcycle, the same one he had arrived on weeks ago. It sat there, waiting for him like an old friend, ready to carry him to the next place, the next story, the next life he would quietly change. Lisa stepped outside just as Keanu swung his leg over the seat. She didn't speak, but her expression said everything. She wiped at her cheek, offering him a small, bittersweet smile. Keanu returned it with a wink. "Take care, kid." She laughed, shaking her head. "You too." And then, he started the engine. The low rumble filled the quiet night as he gripped the handlebars, his gaze lingering on the store one last time. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken, something grateful. Then, with a twist of the throttle, he rode off into the darkness. His silhouette faded into the horizon, the distant roar of his bike slowly melting into the night. But what Keanu left behind wasn't just a store with fresh paint and new shelves. He left behind hope. He left behind kindness. He left behind a reminder that even the smallest acts of humanity, the smallest choices to be good, could ripple out in ways that changed lives forever. Tom stood there long after the sound of the engine had disappeared, staring down the road, lost in thought. Lisa stepped beside him, her arms crossed against the cool breeze. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Tom let out a breath, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe," he said, "but even if we don't, he'll always be here." Lisa nodded, understanding. Keanu hadn't just changed their store, he had changed their hearts. And that was something no amount of distance could ever take away. The night air felt different, heavier, yet somehow lighter at the same time. Tom and Lisa stood in silence, watching the empty road where Keanu had disappeared. The world seemed quieter now, as if even the wind had paused to acknowledge what had just passed. After a long moment, Lisa let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You know, I never really believed people like him existed," she admitted. the kind that just help, without wanting anything in return. Tom glanced at her, a knowing look in his eyes. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But maybe that's why it matters so much. People like him remind us of what's possible." Lisa nodded, hugging her arms tighter against the breeze. The store behind them, once on the brink of collapse, now stood as something more than just a business. It was a place of second chances, a symbol of what could be rebuilt when kindness was the foundation. Tom exhaled, his gaze sweeping over the storefront. "Come on, kid," he said, nudging Lisa gently. "We've got work to do." As they stepped inside, the warm glow of the store's lights greeted them. The shelves were stocked. The air was filled with the familiar scent of fresh coffee, and something intangible yet undeniable had settled into the very walls. Hope, somewhere out there. Keanu was already on his way to his next destination, ready to help someone else. But here, in this small town, his presence would never truly leave. And for Tom and Lisa, that was enough.